The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield. I'm here with John Cuna, as always. Today, we will be discussing Chamique Holdsclaw and adjustment. So we chose adjustment because, one of the, I think it was the recap episode, after episode 10, we discussed what we did episodes 1 through 10. We started to get into the concept of kind of mental fitness, mental health, mental illness, and how we want to make sure we're kind of covering those three territories pretty evenly. I think adjustment can kind of relate to all three in a way, and I think it's definitely something that we all go through because when life events happen and adversity happens, there is an adjustment period, or when you go through transitions in life, there's an adjustment period, and we all have adversity that happens, and we all go through transitions through different periods, whether it's related to age and development or moving, things like that, job loss. There's a lot of things which we're going to get into, but that's why we chose this as the topic that we wanted to get into, because we hadn't focused on that yet, and I think it relates to a lot of different things. So just to give everyone a quick bio, so Chamique Holdsclaw is a former professional basketball player in the WNBA. She retired in 2007. I believe she briefly came out of retirement in 2009 to play and then re-retired. She was inducted into the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame in 2018. She played basketball at the University of Tennessee under Pat Summitt from 1995 to 1999. A couple interesting facts. She's the all-time leader in points and rebounds at Tennessee. That's men's or women's basketball players. She went first in the draft when she came out and was drafted into the WNBA. She's the first ever female ESPN Player of the Week, and that was when she was in college. And she currently works as a mental health advocate. So we always try to focus and connect people to a charitable organization that the athlete works with or supports. We put for this one, it's childmind.org. It's Project You Are OK of the Child Mind Institute. So we put a link on there. And they reach out to teens directly and allow them to engage in the conversation about mental health on their terms in their space online. It's a safe, welcoming, and fun online platform where they can watch and share videos, which I think is a really cool concept. So we put the link to that in the show notes. She also has, I think, Chamique Holdsclaw Foundation, but I couldn't find like a direct link to that. But for people just to know that I think that is out there, is something she's done a lot and probably relates to the camps she runs, which we'll get into. So I'm excited, to talk about Chamique Holdsclaw on a personal level, because for me, she was someone who I really enjoyed watching when I was growing up. So I played basketball, I played soccer, basketball, and baseball. I got rid of soccer around age 12 and then just focused on basketball and baseball through to the end of high school. Played at a decent level. I wasn't, an all-American track athlete like someone over here.
Settle down.
Don't hold it against me. But I really was passionate about basketball and baseball, and watching Chamique Holdsclaw in college when she was at Tennessee, I remember that distinctly. This was around I think I was 12 to 16 years old when she was in college at Tennessee, and this was like the days of watching SportsCenter every morning and that kind of thing, and watching her play basketball I distinctly remember it because she had a fluidity to the way she played, and it just seemed effortless, which is interesting because when you watch the documentary, she actually I never heard her talk about basketball really, or at least I don't remember because it was a long time ago. She talks about how for her it was like an art form, and to me that clicked into memories because I remember watching her and kind of thinking wow, she's so fluid with the ball, how'd she do that? And so she was one of my favorite basketball athletes, in addition to a lot of guys in the NBA that I grew up watching when I was growing up. So she had a big impact on me wanting to get better at basketball. And I think that's my first takeaway, is that I was just interested to learn more about her her overall story, because it ties into me growing up and being passionate about sports. So I want to talk a little bit, obviously the topic is adjustment, so I want to talk a little bit about adjustment as it relates to Chamique Holdsclaw's story, and what were your takeaways with regard to that, John?
I think my first takeaway, there was a bunch. She's had a lot of things that she's like had to adjust to, given her circumstances, which we're going to get into more detail. But I guess I feel like kind of like a broken record, but I feel like it was another example of an athlete who's used sports as a vehicle to, like, as a therapeutic vehicle to sort of go through different things that she had been going through. So how to compartmentalize all this stuff and struggles that she had growing up and put it in a single place and to execute. And I saw that as being problematic, because we see this story over and over and over again of an athlete who maybe came from trauma, came from some extenuating circumstances, and then sort of like, athletics is what I'm going to do to process this stuff
they
without
throw
actually
themselves in
right
to that,
without actually doing the back end work of processing it. And so what it does is it buys you time, and it does. That's all.
And
it
makes
does.
you great as an athlete.
Sure does.
You
right.
channel that emotion into excelling at something. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the story that was one of the main themes that I brought from it. Was another example of someone who utilized sports, for the right intention, but the overall long-standing impact was not great. And she talks a lot now, as like through her journey of processing all that different stuff. And I thought that was my biggest takeaway, from watching that documentary.
Yeah, and it's from a young age, she even said in the documentary, like, I didn't know how to deal with this stuff, and so my solution was to go out on the court, kind of at all times of the day, and just throw myself into basketball. And it is one of those examples that we keep revisiting, where it kind of it gives these athletes an opportunity to get through, right? It allows them to keep living and get through day to day, and get better at a sport, because they're just really like throwing themselves into that on a daily basis, which allows them to practice at a level that other people who maybe aren't struggling as much in life are not practicing at. So it's like this, it's not, I want to say blessing and a curse, but it's like this thing that on the one hand gets them through and lifts them up to allow them to excel in athletics, and yet at some point down the line is going to end up really coming back to haunt them if they're not doing some of the other stuff that we talk about along the way, like developing other purpose or passions, focusing on mental fitness, and then being able to let some of that emotion out in a constructive way, whether it's in therapy or something else. So we see this kind of story quite a bit, right? And I think that's both kind of sad and also kind of inspiring. I feel like we're getting to a level where athletes are starting to pick up on that.
Yeah.
And hopefully, because they're picking up on that, and athletes like Chamique Holdsclaw are talking about it, they'll intervene earlier so that they'll still have the drive, one might say the grim drive, to exceed or excel at sports, while also intervening in subtle ways along the path. So that when they get to a certain point, they're not going to have things come crashing down.
Yeah, I think what's also hard is that it's like their love, right?
Yeah.
Like they love what they do in that sport, which is why it's like, well, I don't feel badly and I feel good while I'm doing it, right? So conceptually, you're like, that makes sense, right? Of course,
and it's a great thing.
And it's a great thing. It's healthy for me. I'm being active. Like you can convince yourself that all the stuff that you're not trying to address is less important than that sport, right? And that's why you see that pattern of people diving in, they entrench themselves even more, and then they start to sort of abuse that relationship, really, and everything starts to deteriorate as time sort of passes through. The less you think about it, the more impactful it becomes.
Yeah, and I think I would guess it's hard for athletes and people in general. Like if you sat them down, let's say we were in a therapy session with someone, and you asked them to visualize life after the sport, what would that look like, and really try to envision the day-to-day, and which I think is a good exercise for people to do. I think people struggle with that sometimes because it's just there's a level of kind of denial and kicking the can down the road, like, I'll be fine, like whatever, I don't need to worry about that now, I'm happy now, I'll get to that later. And I think they underestimate what life is really going to be like functionally overall without that in their life, and because there are so many elements to it. And she actually talks about this, where it's not just I think the removal of the sport and the passion is the biggest thing, right? But it's also I think for a lot of athletes, it's the removal of the camaraderie, right? The teammate context is gone. You no longer have that. It's almost like what happens for a lot of non-athletes when they're done with college. Like high school and college is kind of like your final sort of forced social environment where you're around all people your own age who you can connect with. That doesn't really happen ever again in life. Unless, like for me, I worked in the restaurant industry in between careers, and it kind of had that effect because there's a lot of people that were similar age, and even the ones that were a different age kind of had a similar attitude, mentality in a good way, like personality and camaraderie. So that kind of mimicked it. But I think for most people, after college, they no longer have those opportunities to be around people their own age they connect with. And athletes, it's the same. It's like that camaraderie in the locker room and flights and, travel, that kind of stuff is gone. So you lose your teammates, you lose the camaraderie, you lose the sport and your main passion. I think she even mentioned the fans, the rush she got. I think that was something for her, and this probably relates. I think this kind of ties into something similar to Robin Lehner. Robin Lehner, when we focused on that episode, he talked about how bipolar helped him as a goalie. She talked similarly about recognizing how bipolar helped her on the basketball court. So that rush she got from playing basketball, you can see it's like 4 or 5 different components that are now gone.
Right.
And what do you fill that void with? And I think people struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, actually, that's funny. When I do that exercise a lot of like, hey, what else do you do, or what's after sports?
Yeah.
The most common response that I get is I don't allow myself. I can't think like that.
Yeah.
Right. I can't go there. I can't think like that. Right. Because this is everything right now. Yep. Right. And for me, again, like as I'm going through sort of like the assessment for athletes of talking about like where are some things that we need to really address, and that's definitely a red flag for me of like I can't allow myself to think like that. It's like, well,
how do you handle that when they say that?
In the moment, I will say of like, I think that'd be important for us to talk about. I don't spend too much time because they're at such an entrenched place of like, if you were to say we're going to talk about that,
you risk.
I risk jeopardizing that initial relationship. But I do say we're going to come back to that. I do say, I'm curious about that and how that impacts your performance and your just day-to-day life. Why don't we spend some time talking about that at some other time? Yeah. And they're always like, oh yeah, sure, absolutely, right. Yeah. And then we can come back to it when we've established more of a rapport. They start to do some of the stuff that we've been talking about. But that's always a question that I ask because it is really fascinating to get those answers. And it is a red flag for someone like, I can't think like that. Yeah. This is everything. I have to put all my attention to here, everything here. And in my head, it's like, well, that's not first, like it's not controllable. Like you could get injured, sport could end, anything could happen. COVID, right? This disrupted everybody's. And now it's like, if that's the only thing you do, now it's nothing. Yeah. What are we going to do?
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that you make a good point. I feel like that's a skill as a clinician that you have, because I think younger or less experienced clinicians would push that issue too quick, and it diminishes the trust, and it's going to put the wall up for the person. They're not going to want to open up to you because you go too quickly into that thing that's kind of like a third rail in the beginning.
Right.
You develop that trust, and you get into that eventually when they're ready, which I think is really cool. So from an adjustment perspective, I think this is what, again, she has a diagnosis of bipolar, but that to me is not the big story with her, right? What we're talking about now. The story is just the level of adjustment she's had to go through different life events, which I think a lot of people can relate to. I don't want to minimize her experience because it's unique in its own sense, and it's her, and she's been through a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of people in life have different adjustments and transitions, so I think that's why we wanted to focus on that, because everybody has some level of an adjustment or transition that they go through at different periods. For her, it was to the nth degree, I think. She really went through a lot. She was parentified at a young age, it sounds like. She had, I think, 2 alcoholic parents.
Yeah.
One who had schizophrenia, right? Yeah. And she had to grow up quick, right? She had to kind of take care of them a little bit, take care of her younger brother. Then eventually, I think that went along too far and crossed the line, I think, with her parents needing help, and she had to go live with her grandmother, which was kind of 2 adjustments in one, because 1, she was taken away from her parents. 2, she had to go live in a very different area. She kind of described it as going from sort of the suburbs to the projects, and I think that is a massive adjustment, not just in different environment, but it's like a different culture and different things that are going on there. So there's multiple adjustments in one with that. Then she goes to Tennessee and has to adjust to Pat Summitt. I think that Pat Summitt was a coach that I always looked at as very, just very impressed. I mean, she was clearly like really good at what she did, but you could tell she was intense too. And I think, some athletes love that and some struggle with it. And Chamique Holdsclaw kind of talks about that in the documentary about, Pat Summitt had a lot of experience as a coach and knew which athletes, maybe in terms of which ones to push. So she had to adjust to that because I don't think that was her experience receiving coaching in high school. Then she had to adjust to the instant fame while at Tennessee, because she thinks she won the national championship as a freshman, and by sophomore or junior year was like the talk of the nation from a basketball perspective. So adjusting to instant fame, basically. Around that same time, her dad was put in a psychiatric hospital due to schizophrenia. Then she had to adjust to the WNBA. I think that was really hard for her. Mm-hmm. One, you're living on your own for the first time. That's different. Then I think losing was a big adjustment for her. It sounded like she was used to winning. Used to winning in high school, used to winning at Tennessee. You go to the DC Mystics in the WNBA, and like when you're the first pick of the draft in any sport, there's a good chance your team's going to suck. Let's face it.
Be going on a good team. That's
right.
why they have.
That's why they have the first pick.
Right.
So coming from a culture, multiple cultures of winning, to a culture of losing, when she was clearly a competitive person, which was kind of cool to see. Like that's hard to adjust to. And I think she even said she looked around and like teammates were fine with it, and she's like, "Why don't you care? Like what's going on?" Yeah. Then her grandmother died in 2002. I think she was really close to her grandmother. Retired twice. Again, we talked about not getting the same rush from playing the sport, not having to travel, fans, teammate, missing the creativity and the art form of it. That's a lot to adjust to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was a takeaway, I think, is like just how many different things she had to adjust to.
Yeah. And then one of the other things too, like her mom coming back into her life and being a little bit more involved. There's just been she has had injuries and things like there's been a lot of different opportunities for her along her journey where she's had to adjust to different things.
Absolutely. A couple other so one I want to talk to you, John, is this she touches on basketball being her release. And we've talked about it a little bit, but I want to see if you have any thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, just kind of similar to what we had talked about. I think that for a lot of athletes, that's one of the biggest things that I hear. Like it's a great place for me to like store my emotions or release some of my emotions or let some of those things go. I think she talked about this in the documentary too, like with the bipolar. It almost like that manic state that she used to get into played into her strengths that she identifies with. Like she saw basketball not as like a points thing or a rebounds thing or a whatever. She saw it as like an art form. Yeah. And she felt that she could be like the most creative she could be on the court. Mm-hmm. And I think that, when you have such a tunnel vision of like, this is the only place that I can do that, I think that's where obviously problems came up. Unchecked bipolar too for a long time. We can go into a whole other conversation about, equal access to help and stuff like that. But I think her ability to get into like leaning too heavily on sports as a release for her led to her inability to like adjust to these different things kind of moving forward. So I think it was really, and again, same point we've been making before, this is what we see time and time and time again with athletes across the board.
Yeah, and I would imagine non-athletes struggle with these things at times, whether they have that one thing, whether it's a job or something else in their life that they really go to for most of their joy or to keep themselves in a good place. There's always a risk that could get taken away for some reason.
Right.
And I think, not that you have to be obsessed with having like a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth backup plan, but it's good to be well-rounded and develop some passions because, as you go through different stages of life, things change, and especially physically, and you can't always do what you used to do, and you got to be able to adjust and take on kind of new, it's almost like taste buds changing. You have to be able to take on new things that keep you going in a good place, and you not reinvent yourself as a person, but you're gradually overlapping stages so that when one comes to an end, it's not this abrupt switch or adjustment period. You're able to smoothly adjust because you've accounted for that. I think that's where we try to do with clients.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been really cool is watching that she's now been able to translate that creativity that she found in basketball and put it into her advocacy work. Like she does lots of like speeches and talks, and she runs camps for kids, talking about mental fitness, talking about the importance of these different things. And I think that's a perfect example of somebody who has been able to say like, okay, the creativity is expandable, right? The me as a person who enjoys being artistic and fluid and creative, basketball is not the only avenue that captures that ability in myself. And she's done the work clearly to be able to say, well, I can also do that in here and get same. She even talks about like when she goes up and talks to different big groups of people about her journey, that she gets that that rush, not to the same level that where you get to the manic pieces that she talks about, but she gets that same level. I think that's a perfect example of someone who has been able to adjust in a good way from something that once brought her a lot of joy that she can't do anymore to something that can sort of replace that piece. And she's been able to make that adjustment. I think that we're going to get into that in a little bit, but that's a really, really good example of that, to see someone do that.
Totally. Yeah. The camp she runs and how supportive she is to kids. And, one part of the documentary that stood out was when they were all sitting down kind of like in a circle and talking about stuff. Like, that is something that I even remember from when I was an athlete growing up. I felt like it was noticeable that wasn't present. Like, there was no human element to the camp. It was just grind, and get better in an athlete, and don't feel pain, and don't talk about anything real. Just focus on being an athlete, particularly with basketball camps. So it's like I felt seeing that was awesome, because they were talking about real life things. They were talking about emotions, and the kids were so eloquent about it, and they were young kids too. It was super cool to see that. Yeah. Talking openly and not even worrying for a second about what their peers were thinking about what they're saying. That is something that I think people like Chamique Holdsclaw have enabled to happen on a much larger scale, because that wasn't the case probably 5, but definitely 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Certainly when we were growing up. So
no, and it was cool. There was that I think it was that same scene. There was one girl who was sharing that, her friends are teasing her, and she gets angry, and then there was someone off in the background. I just heard yeah, me too. And her whole face and demeanor changed. It was just oh, okay. Like that. And then I think Chamique picked up on that and was like, yeah, we're not alone. Everybody, we think that these are things that just we're going through, but everybody has those things. And it's awesome.
Yeah, it was really cool. And I think you can tell that, one clip that kind of stood out to me was when Meta World Peace, who used to be known as Ron Artest, talks about, I think he grew up in New York around the same time as her. He was a couple years older than her. And he also, he was joking around about her beating him on the court and her beating lots of guys on the court. So that was pretty funny. But he also talked about how he said what she's doing right now is more impactful than this fun little circle. And he held out the ball, which I love that guy. He's so hilarious.
Yeah.
And he's himself. He's unapologetically himself, which I think is really cool. And I think he's someone that I didn't realize it until I actually saw her documentary and seeing him talk, but he's someone that early on came out, and he even talked about how he thanked his psychiatrist after they won, which I think was in 2010.
Yep.
And he said that was met with a lot of you're crazy.
Yeah.
It shows you how it was a much different time 10, 11 years ago. And I think it's cool that he was one of the first people that was willing to be vocal about that. And the fact that he said, he called it out in a good way for her, that what she's doing right now is more impactful than what she ever did on the basketball court, which is awesome. Not obviously functionally it's awesome, but for her it's awesome, because it's it validates that basketball is not it for you, and that you can develop other passions, which I think was really cool.
Yeah, I agree.
Last takeaway I had is that she finally put herself first. Her whole life, I think she spent trying to make sure everyone else was okay, trying to take care of family members at a young age when she shouldn't have had to do that. And when she was retiring, she just said, my life is more important than basketball. Yeah. And I think that was really cool that she got to the point where she was able to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to shift a little bit into the, adjustment section of this, so that, we always cover a mental health topic, mental fitness topic, or a mental illness. We kind of try to cover those equally throughout the episodes. Today we're going to talk about adjustment. And similar to the Dak Prescott recovery episode, I'm going to do more of a Q&A with you, John, where I'm going to toss you some questions about adjustment. So how would you describe adjustment in general, or talk about adjustment from a mental health perspective?
So, just from a clinical lens, there's a lot of different subcategories for it. So adjustment basically is the presence of an emotional or behavioral symptoms or signs that's sort of in a response to a stressor. Something happened. We're going to get into some typical ones that we see more frequently within the first 3 months of that stressor sort of coming aboard. And so you'll see irritability, you'll see distress, you'll see disruption in daily functioning, those types of things. That's typically what we see for adjustment, impacting sleep, a lot of different things. We're going to get into how that sort of maybe became a little bit problematic and sort of becoming a catch-all for everything. But that was that's from the clinical piece. So with adjustment, you can have just an adjustment disorder, an inability to sort of go through that. You can have it with depressed mood. You can have it with anxiety. You can have it with both of them. You can have it with disturbance of conduct. So this typically is with younger kids, where the behavior is what comes out. So they may be a little bit more, disobedient, or anger outbursts or tantrums or things like that. That's typically some of the stuff that you see. Or
so this is something where like we'll take the kid as an example. A kid goes through some kind of life event or transition, and in that post event period of adjustment, certain things are happening from a mental health perspective that may reach criteria for like an adjustment disorder diagnosis.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
That's interesting because adjustment disorder. So there's adjustment and adjustment disorder, right? And we're going to talk about both a little bit. Adjustment is obviously a normal, natural thing that we all go through in life. When it comes to certain things happening, which you're going to talk about in a second. I think adjustment disorder has been, it's not as much now, but for a long time was kind of like a catch-all diagnosis, which sort of reflected like the over-pathologizing of the need for diagnoses in mental health with mental illness. I think for a long time, this reflects like the insurance landscape and insurance companies needing people to justify why they get help from a therapist, which we need to move past. I think we're getting better. I think since they shifted things, maybe in the DSM-5 or since then, there's a little bit more flexibility around not necessarily having to have that, but still, they require a diagnosis to get treatment. And, which shouldn't be that way. Like people, we need to intervene earlier on so that they're not getting to the point where they have mental illness. And to me, adjustment disorder is kind of a way for insurance companies or I know therapists have taken advantage of this to be able to fit things in that diagnosis, because otherwise they might just be adjusting to a life event, but they don't reach criteria for depression or anxiety or something more serious. And if they don't diagnose them with adjustment disorder, the insurance company will deny the access to care. And so that's like a huge problem in our field, I think, where we can't pathologize diagnoses. We have to get to the point where people can get the support they need earlier on without having to feel like they have to fit into a diagnosis.
I agree.
So what are the most common things in life, from a general adjustment perspective that people tend to struggle adjusting to?
Most common ones that I come into contact with would be sort of like environment. So environmental changes. So move towns, new school, new home, new job, new friends. I mean, there's a lot of that type of stuff. Like the environment in which you are in somehow changes or shifts. And that could be a whole host of different things. So that's typically the number one things that I see. Oftentimes when I was working in schools, it was new kids coming to the school and we had a lot of international students that came in, and that's a massive change. So not just a new school, a new home, a new culture, language, everything was different. So that's another piece too. A new like sibling, so inviting another like family member into that's usually an adjustment period. And then death is definitely another big one that comes into play too. That's a major adjustment for people to have to go through. And then again, specific to the work that I like to do, is injury. So with athletes specifically, that's a massive adjustment. Sort of kind of flirts with death in terms of like there's a grieving process to it. But those are sort of like the most common ones that typically come into play like when I'm talking specifically about adjustment. Those are the top ones. Yeah, and
I mean, just hearing you talk about that, it hits home like how often that stuff happens. Like how often do you change schools, or like when you go to high school to college, or when you go from college, let's say you have to move back home to save money before you can live on your own, or even if you from college to living on your own, I think is its own adjustment. Breakups obviously are a huge adjustment. Job changes, things like that require a period of adjustment, and some people adapt at a normal pace in that period, and other people don't. They really struggle. The pandemic is obviously like
having to live at home for a year.
Being stuck inside. I think post-pandemic is going to be adjustment too. I know it's easy for us to to think that as things continue to ease that we're all going to be fine, but I think it's going to require its own adjustment period, and some people might struggle with that, even though it's good, obviously a good thing to get out of a pandemic or closer to normalcy. Not everyone's going to adjust perfectly to that. It might be really hard for people. It might take a period. It might be speed bumps along the way. So what is the zone or timeline of adjustment, John, when it comes to like, when things have gone beyond the period of kind of quote unquote adjustment, and now we're concerned because maybe within that period they should have adjusted at their own pace, but within reason? What does that time zone or period look like versus when it gets too far?
Right. So we typically talk about it in two different ways, like acute and chronic, or long standing. So acute is anything under 6 months.
Okay.
So we typically that's the time zone that we look at of like from when the stimulus or change happened that the client is adjusting to?
Yep.
Has it been within 6 months?
Okay.
So, and I think that this is one of the things that I ran into when I was working in schools that was slightly problematic, is that 6 months is essentially, depending on when the kid comes to school, that's a whole school year. So, that's a long time, but it's sort of still within the range of like typical potential of adjusting, but it also is like that's half a year, right? That's a long time for people to have that. And then you can go into the chronic, which is basically just anything outside of that 6 months. So when stuff starts to really, like, your daily function is impacted and unable to sort of get back to normalcy and get back to normal routines, and relationships might be deteriorating, that type of stuff. When it goes past that 6 month piece that it's still impacting you, that's really where I find like we get into like the adjustment specific stuff, and sort of like get into the diagnostic work and treatment. That's really like anything more than 6 months is sort of like a pretty major red flag.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to put it. So I know more recently, right, with we just talked a few minutes ago about the easing of the pandemic and us kind of getting back to some normalcy here. One example of that is how schools are really starting to open up more and more across the boards to having kids go back in person, thankfully.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on just for parents and or for kids adjusting to the process of going back to school in person full time?
Yeah, I think we really could spend almost an entire episode talking about this.
Yeah.
Maybe we should, because I think this is going to be a major one. I think that the default for schools is everything back to normal. Like, kids are resilient. You mean
from the school's perspective?
From the school's perspective,
okay.
Yeah. I think that, and quite frankly, I think from an adult perspective too, I think that we often put too much on the fact that, like, kids are resilient.
Yeah.
And, like, while I do agree with that, it doesn't mean that they... Like, we can't help them because they're just tough, right? They're people as well. So I think that could be almost like a strategy that works almost like not well enough, or you overutilize that of like, well, let's just get back to normal structure, normal everything, and basically just try to like forget what happened. And we're not going to talk about it. Maybe we'll spend like a day or two talk. What did you do during the pandemic? Which I have my own problems with, because for a lot of kids, it's not going to necessarily be a memorable one,
that could
potentially
be like,
re-triggering
traumatic
things that happened during the pandemic, loss of loved ones, all these different things. So,
which teachers don't always know, like, and that's not their fault necessarily, but from like a mental health perspective and a trauma perspective, they may not know that asking that question risks eliciting some emotions from that trauma. I agree.
Right. I think, but that's like the being in schools, I was in schools for a long time, and that just, you sort of just like learn a little bit of the systems, and that's definitely one that they lean on, of like, let's just get back to normal. Yeah. And I while I agree with the concept of providing structure and routine for kids and people who are going through things, I think that that's valuable, but without the accurate processing or like real processing of the stuff that happened, it can be problematic. And again, it kind of leads into like teaching kids like forget about what just happened and just focus on this. I think that's a mixed message for kids, and then toppled with like, well, they're resilient, so they can just deal with it. I think is hard. And so I think for parents helping kids go back in, again, I think maybe we could spend maybe half an episode talking about some like really helpful things. But I think that I would I think you're safe. I think that's a big one. I think it's okay to go back to school. And
so buying into the fact that it's okay to be transitioning back.
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of apprehension across the board. Kids have been hearing just similar stuff that we've been hearing about the dangers of going back. And, in our household, we call them the germs. That's what they've been referred to. And so I think, having conversations with your kids about like, hey, this is what's going to go back. It's going to be weird. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be different. I think that's okay for them to know that. And then being able to have the conversations with them about it, engage them with, have maybe some fun activities when the kids are coming home, to be planning of like how to wrap that up a little bit. And, I think the structure will be good. I think there's going to be a massive deep breath and exhale from parents who have had to be doing full-time work and full-time parenting. It's been a struggle.
I was thinking that's one thing that came to my mind was like, obviously going back to school is not going to fix everything, and we have to pump the brakes on expecting it to just be perfect right away. And yet at the same time, as soon as those kids go back, I feel like parents should like maximize self-care in those moments. Like, go do something. You've just been like saddled with like 3 full-time jobs, and been isolated and stuck around family for a long time, which even for the strongest families is really hard, because you get no balance to your life.
Yeah.
I think it's taken a toll on people, and it's hard to even know the toll until we get some separation.
Yeah.
So I think keep that in mind. There may be some bumps, and when the kids go to school, go do something for yourself and maximize that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. I think teachers are going to need an enormous amount of support as well. And I think, quite frankly, I think they've been a little bit almost forgotten in this process of like, oh, the teachers can handle it, right? And so I think they're going to need a lot of support of like what that's looks like rolling in. I think that we always talk about like the honeymoon period for like when kids come back from school. It's usually like they're coming back from a summer. Everyone's sort of like hyped up and excited. September usually goes pretty well, and then October, November starts to roll in. The work increases, gets colder, and we see like a little bit of a shift in mood and behavior. And I think that's going to be exaggerated a little bit this year.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to be coming in with as much excitement. I think we're going to be coming into the school year with a lot of apprehension and fear as well, unlike we've really experienced before. How school is going to look. How are you going to keep my kids safe? There's going to be a lot of anxiety from parents and from kids as well. I think we have to be able to address that and also give it some time to really like work through that. So I think I think the understanding of what is going to be, I think, is important to start with. Of like, you're going to be anxious. That's fine. Everybody else is going to be feeling anxious about what that looks like. Celebrate it, right? Definitely be excited about it. That it's going to be, not you having to work full time with doing, parenting and your job. So I think that's going to be a good thing to celebrate. I think the first thing that needs to be really addressed is just like, it's safe, or you're good. This is great. There might be some hard things with it. The relationships and friendships are going to be an adjustment period too, like seeing your friends more consistently. Maybe there's some kids who haven't seen their friends in a year and what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
And how that's going to be addressed, and, how our school is going to manage that will be interesting to see how that rolls out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think especially because we're already, when we're recording this anyway, it's second week of March. And I feel like this year, I don't want to call it, this school year in particular, like a wash, but like I do, especially for younger kids, it's like their mental health is much more important than necessarily like what grades they get this year, especially again at younger ages. I think it's important to kind of like be a little bit more accepting of maybe mental health days as a concept. Prioritizing mental health and their adjustment more than, necessarily having to have them back. So let's say like they go back and the first 2 weeks are really tough for them and you can see signs from a parenting perspective. I think it's okay to like give them a day or two off from school altogether. You're getting towards the end of the year. To me, that's how I think it should be, or at least like considered, so that we're not expecting just this abrupt change. Because some kids might love that. I think a lot of kids are missing the in-person stuff, and I think a lot of kids are resilient. They're gonna be okay, but some kids may struggle with that. And
some kids have done amazing with the online learning and done way better with not having to go to schools, and that's going to be a huge adjustment for them going back into a place that like was probably more of a struggle than being at home in their comfort zone getting their work done. Like I have plenty of clients who are like, I'm not very much looking forward to going back to school because I've really enjoyed my environment that I've been able to do my schoolwork, and are actually thriving.
And I think I respect and appreciate teachers. I really do. And John, I also think that parents have I think us looking at teachers has been put on like this pedestal, like, oh, they have it so bad, and we have to look out for the teachers. I think we got to put the parents up into the same level. Like parents have had to be the teacher for the most part, and be the parents and work full time for the like better part of like 14 months. So I think it's just good to put the parents up there at the same level.
I agree. Yeah, they're gonna need, and I think after us talking about this though, I think we should maybe expand, like do a fuller episode on like supports for both kids, and adults as well. I think that'd be useful.
Yeah. So, what do you work on with clients when it comes to adjustment? Any kind of go-to strategies, whether it's youth or adults?
Yeah, some of the same stuff. So I do a lot of the a lot of times with adjustment, like anxiety is a pretty prevalent symptom or sign that kind of comes through. So we talk a lot about like coping mechanisms and a lot about like de-stressors or things like that, of like how to manage that type of stuff, whether it's externalize it somewhere else, put it down on paper, talk about it, stuff like that. I think that's a big one, finding proper coping skills for the anxiety. Learn why it caused so much disruption. This is more of like long-term conversation, but understanding like what was it specific about this transition that caused this much disruption in your life, and trying to understand like the details of why that kind of happened. And then with a balance of allowing for processing, but helping them bring back normal routines that was good for them. And quite frankly, adjustment can be a really great opportunity to sort of rebuild routines and habits back into your life that are positive, and like you spoke about before, like the removal of ones that maybe weren't the most beneficial for you. So I think that, you know, helping them bring back to normal routines, help them get back into access with their support networks, so whoever that is, family, friends, helping them get back in touch with that.
It sounds like that. So you make a great point there. I want to touch on that.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're describing is kind of like minimizing the contrast, like, because when you adjust from one thing to the next, that contrast between A and B is what makes it so stark and hard to adjust. If you can pull positive elements from A and make sure they're in place for B, it maybe minimizes that contrast and reduces it, which would make the adjustment easier.
Yeah,
okay,
definitely. It's sort of like a blend of both. And I think I've talked about this a lot. A lot of the work that I do with my clients is like the concept of like polarity management, of like two opposing ideas and trying to blend the best of both. And this is sort of the example of that, of kind of like not being, you know, the jolt and shock of the initial adjustment that brought you into the office. If I do the exact same thing in the opposite way, it's not really going to serve its purpose very well. It's just going to be another massive like shock and jolt, and that's what caused you to be here. So finding ways of like, well, let's reintroduce your support networks. You got a lot of like energy from being around people. Let's find a way that we can make that work. You've lost touch with some people that you used to have a good relationship with. Let's find ways that maybe we can get in touch with those people again to like build back things that you generated strength from. And then getting into some of the like nitty gritty, well, how's your sleep? How's your nutrition? How's your exercise? Kind of covering that type of stuff, because those are often the first three that kind of go away as you're trying to like deal with these different things, and then kind of help instill some optimism, hope, goal development, purpose development, all the stuff that I kind of go to of like, well, let's find some things we want to work on to kind of keep us moving forward in that and get unstuck.
So not being too stuck or fixated on the temporary challenges that they're going through, and really trying to like have a vision towards the hope and optimism.
Exactly, because essentially that's a lot of times that's what happens. You get stuck in that period of
you think it's going to last forever,
right? This is just what it is.
Yeah.
You can't get yourself past that, and so helping them work to develop new goals in the future is really good, while identifying their hindrances and fears through fear setting or other exercises like that, to help them understand like these are the things that are going to consistently try to hold you back. Plan for them. And then identify where you want to move to, and that typically is a pretty good. That's another one that I usually really go to, and then really trying to help them understand, and again, like help them understand like their own confidence and their ability to do that, like that their self-efficacy is probably taking a hit. So helping them understand like what are you good at, what are your strengths, what are the things that you perform well at, and really, really capitalize on those things to kind of help generate some movement forward. Yeah,
so that reminds me of the Simone Biles episode we did, where it was remembering that you've done this before. And you had, it's sort of that cultivating confidence that you do with a lot of clients, where you're really encouraging them to weigh the positives as much as the negatives, right? They may be going through some negative things. It's easy to lose sight and forget about the positive things going on, or the strengths that they have put into place in the past. And remembering that they are capable of doing these things, I would imagine that it sounds more like cultivating confidence that helps them adjust.
Yeah. And an exercise I do, and I would encourage people to do it right now, if I were to say, list out 5 things that you don't really like about yourself, and then give me 5 things you like about yourself. You could probably list out 30 things you don't like about yourself and struggle to come up with 1 or 2. And that's that imbalance. And helping them understand of like, get them refocused and get them more in access to the strengths. It helps them to sort of like, okay, I can do this. I can keep working. I can keep moving. And then identifying where they want to work to and how you're going to get there. And that's sort of the process that we kind of go through.
Absolutely. That's great. So we're going to wrap up for today. We want to, remind people just to subscribe to the Grim Drive podcast on YouTube. You can go to YouTube and just search the Grim Drive podcast. At some point, we'd like to get our own custom URL, which would make the search process even easier. That's the whole point. We need to get to 100 subscribers.
Come on,
close.
People.
We just need a little bit of help. Anyone who's willing to help us out and click subscribe on YouTube. We also want to encourage people to check out a new podcast called We're All a Little Crazy. It's done by Theo Fleury, Darren Ravel, and Eric Cussin. Theo Fleury is a former NHL, I think, hockey goalie. Darren Ravel is a sports media person, I think. And then Eric Cussin started, the Same Here movement, global mental health movement. So it's really cool what they're doing, and it's a podcast that covers mental health related topics, and we encourage everyone to check that out. So we want to thank everyone for listening to the Grim Drive podcast today for this discussion about Chamique Holdsclaw and adjustment. We will be back next week to talk about Ben Gordon and bipolar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.